Good morning students. Today we are going to discuss about client server architecture. Client server architecture is also known as distributed application, where one application requesting services from another application. The requesting application, which we call it as client, and the application providing services, which we call it as server. Let us discuss them in detail. An application design approach in which tasks are divided into two components, namely client and server. Client requests specific services or resources, whereas server in turn receives the request, processes the request, and provide services. The example of client server architecture are web browser, Gmail server. A Gmail server can handle large number of Gmail clients. So similarly, multiple clients can be serviced by a common server. Server and client components typically run on different machines. For example, if you take a Facebook server, the Facebook server is hosted in USA, but we can able to access Facebook through web client from India itself. Next we are going to see about the need of client server architecture, features of client server architecture, and types of client server architecture. Let us see one by one. Before entering into the needs, types, we need to discuss about the real-time example of client server architecture. Opening a bank account. Here, customer acts as a client, whereas bank plays a role of server. Customer must know the address of bank, then only he can able to initiate his request. The customer raises his request to bank for account opening. The bank will provide response by giving the application form. The customer fill the application form and submit to the bank. The bank provides account details to the customer. Now the customer again raises his request by providing his account detail and ask for balance. The bank will also provide balance to the customer. The customer again asks to change his address by giving account details and new address. The bank will also provide the same. Similarly, the customer want to close his account. So the customer once again raises his request by giving his account detail. The bank will close the account of customer. So this is the best example for client server architecture. Here the client will be a customer and the server will be a bank. So this is a figure depicting a client server architecture in which multiple clients request services from server. Server in turn receives the request, prepare a response, and provide the services to the clients. Next we are going to see in depth of client functionalities. So front end of an application. So whenever you enter into a Facebook account or Yahoo account or Gmail account, you need to provide the login details. That we call it as a front end of an application. It provides interface to the user to interact with the application. That we call it as interface. That is login details, Facebook login details or Yahoo login details, which we call it as interface. Example of client program are email client as well as web browser. Server functionalities. Server receives the request from client, prepare response and provide services to the client. Example for a server is Gmail server, web server or whatever it is. Next we are going to discuss about the features of client server architecture. The first feature is multi-user support. As I already told, a Gmail server can handle large number of clients. That we call it as a multi-user support. The next feature is transparency of location. This also I have already mentioned. Facebook server will be hosted in USA, whereas we can able to access Facebook through web client from India itself. That we call it as a transparency of location. Mix and match of platforms. This is nothing but a client and server may have different OS or different architecture. Scalability. Scalability is nothing but if number of users increases, the server can able to handle the request and provide response to the client. Next we are going to see about the types of client server architecture. Normally it is divided into three parts. First one is presentation layer. Presentation layer is nothing but a user interface. I already told user interface is nothing but when you are logging into a social media such as Facebook account or Gmail account, that login account which we call it as a user interface. So you are going to provide input that we call it as user interface, and it will provide response to him. The next layer is business layer. Business layer is nothing but it has some constraints. Suppose if we are going to design a field such as a date field, the date field should satisfy some constraints, MMDDYY, that format that can be fixed by a business people. This that we call it as a business logic, that comes under a business layer. Data layer is nothing but all the datas are getting stored in the database. The business layer should interact with the database layer to provide the necessary functions. The next we are going to discuss about the distribution of layers in client server architecture. There are two types of distributions. One is fat client and another one is thin client. Why it is called fat client means the presentation logic, which is nothing but a user interface, and business logic both should reside on client, whereas data alone reside on server. That is, database alone reside on server. This we call it as fat client. Whereas in thin client, user interface alone present in client, business logic as well as data source present in the server. So again the same thing, determined by the distribution of layers among client and one or more servers. The fat client, which we call it as 2-tier architecture, whereas thin client, which we call it as 3-tier architecture. In 2-tier architecture, presentation and business logic resides on client and data alone reside on database server, whereas in 3-tier architecture, presentation logic resides in client, business as well as data should reside in a database server. So as I already told, this is a figure depicting the 2-tier application, whereas presentation and application logic resides in a client program and the data alone resides in a database server. The example for 2-tier architecture is if you are going to see a result of any student, the student should provide his roll number or register number in the web client. The register number will get processed and provide a response back to the client. The result should be provided to the client. The results are getting stored in the database server. The database server it can match the corresponding registration number, and the matched registration number result should be displayed to the student. That we call it as a 2-tier architecture. And 3-tier architecture, presentation logic resides in a client program, whereas business logic and data source resides in a server program. So here client in turn communicate with application server in turn communicate with database server provide services to the application server in turn, server in turn communicate with the client program. Let us discuss about the 3-tier architecture in brief. As I already told, presentation tier is nothing but a user interface. Here the user interface, they are asking get sales total. So this thing enter into the logic tier and get list of all sales made last year. These details should be taken from the data tier layer, that is database layer. After this data should be taken in the logic tier, the logic should be applied. As I already told, business logic, there should be some constraints will be there. In the business logic, what is the constraint mentioned here is add all sales together. So in the presentation layer, what we are asking is get sales total. We fetch the sales, all the sales details. In the logic tier again, we add all the sales together to display the total sale value to the client. So this is the picture depicting a three-tier architecture. That's all about client server architecture. Thank you, students.